Roman numeral 1 of a new unit called the Gilded Age. So before we get into this, economic growth in the Gilded Age. This next unit that we're going to be beginning in this class is called the Gilded Age, and so let's take a moment to talk about what the Gilded Age means. In a speech at the time, Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain, was asked to talk about what the United States looked like in the last half of the 19th century, because the Gilded Age goes from right after the Civil War, 1865, till 1898. And when he was talking about that, he said that America was in a Gilded Age, is where the term comes from. Gilded means just the surface is covered in gold. So he says at this time America on the surface looks wonderful. We're going to have transcontinental railroads. We'll see fortunes amassed. America is going to go into its second industrial revolution. We're going to see skyscrapers, new technology. America is going to become an industrial powerhouse in the world. And so everything looks like it's really good for America. But if you scratch the surface, if you just go beyond that little top layer of gold and shininess in America, what you're going to see in this unit is we have increased amounts of poverty, lots of immigrants who are going to be living in that poverty. We're going to see farmers struggling. We're going to see crime. We're going to see corruption. We're going to see abuse of people. And so it may be shiny and bright on the outside, but Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain was saying it's rotten at the core. And so that is kind of a summation of what this unit is about. Certainly industrial growth and amazing things happening for some of Americans, and then a lot of struggling for the lower classes of America. All right, so now the picture that we see on this title page. We see a railroad, and it's in the Rocky Mountains. We see Chinese immigrants who helped in the bottom right-hand corner who helped build it. And so the main thing in this lecture that we're going to talk about, what is the thing that is driving, no pun intended, the economy is railroads. Railroads are going to help connect raw materials of the West to factories and markets of the East. So it's going to help tie the economy together. In addition to that, all the things that make a railroad up is you have to have steel, you have to have lumber, coal, glass, leather, copper. All of these things that go into making a train, it's going to, since we're going to be building tons of railroads, trains, locomotives, we're going to need to have all of those industries develop, especially steel. And so we're going to see America, its economy is going to be boosted. The Gilded Age is a time of great economic growth, in part, and to a large part, because of the growth of railroads. So let's start there. Letter A, tying the national economy together. So as I said on the previous slide, we're going to see railroads play a huge part in increasing the American economy because, one, we get raw materials to markets and then finished goods from factories to people, and we also see this desire for need for goods that are going to build our railroads out of, like I said, lumber, steel, those kinds of things. And so we see, number one, rapid post-war growth in railroads. We're going to see the United States in 1865 go from 35,000 miles of railroad track, which made it one of the top countries in the world in 1865 as far as railroad mileage goes, to near the end of the time period, or a little bit past it, to 1900, where we have 192,000 miles of track. So Americans north and south, east and west, are going to be building railroads at an increasingly rapid rate. The picture you see is just the railroad growth in Illinois. 1850, which is the first year on the chart at the top, we see just a small amount of railroads, and then by 1860, 10 years later, we've more than quadrupled the amount of railroads just in Illinois alone. And then it just keeps going up and up and up until we get to about 1900, and then we see railroad growth start to taper off a little bit. Now, these railroads are really expensive. The railroad that we're going to focus on is the Transcontinental Railroad, and the first Transcontinental Railroad you can see on the map. There's several of them there, but the first one is going to be built by the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific right in the middle of the map, going through southern Wyoming and Nebraska. And so this railroad going all the way across America is going to be very expensive. Not just the construction materials and all the workers, but the most important part of it is going to be the land. The railroad companies have to buy up land to put their railroad traffic on. And it's not a thin strip. They're going to have to buy large chunks of land because they haven't yet surveyed that land out west. So they don't know what exactly is going to form the best route, so they have to buy up a bunch. So this is going to be a huge expense for the railroads. and they just can't afford it. It's way too expensive. It would be like today if we're saying we're going to build a railroad to the moon. No private company can afford that, even if it was technically possible. And so the United States government steps in. The United States government is going to do everything it can to help and promote the building of railroads in America, especially the Transcontinental Railroad. So we see the role of the government certainly changing here in the Gilded Age. Because the Civil War kind of ends this democratic idea of having a small government and more power to the states, now, of course, the Republicans are going to have their way. They're still in power, and so we're going to build railroads with the government assistance, because Republicans want, at this time, the government to be strong and powerful, more powerful than the states, and they certainly want the government to be used to promote business. And so what we're going to see is, you can see the pink on the map, that is all land that is given to the railroad companies from the United States government. It's not a loan, it's called a federal land grant, and the United States government is just going to tell the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific or some other railroad company that this is a whole bunch of land, we're talking millions of acres, we're going to give to you for free because we need a railroad. We want a railroad for economics, we want to be able to get out west quickly, and so the federal government is going to just give a huge land giveaway to railroad companies. The next thing it's going to do is it also is going to provide really low interest loans to these railroads and construction companies. And so now they can afford to build the railroads. They don't have to pay a bank back with lots of interest. Now they can just pay the government back with really low interest. So we see two ways that the federal government is helping promote railroad growth. On a local level, we're going to see that railroad towns wants railroads to come into their town, because if you can get a railroad to come into your town, if we look at Denver on the map, eventually they will be connected to the Transcontinental Railroad through a trunk line, which means an additional line. But at the start, they were not part of the Transcontinental Railroad. It went north of us into Wyoming, and so that meant that Denver wasn't going to grow because there's no people coming to Denver. There's no way to get your crops to market. And so towns beg and plead railroads to come through their location. And so we're going to see towns give railroad companies tax breaks. We're going to see towns give them free land. We're going to see them bribe the railroad companies to come through their town. And so government, bottom line, whether it's local, state, or national, is going to do everything they can to build railroads. If you look at the state of Iowa, they go crazy at this time building railroads that they don't need. But this is a great way to, personally, if you're a politician, to get a bunch of money. All you have to do, it's a way to get bribes. The railroad company comes to you, they say we want to build a railroad, and so you say, well, I'll get the state to pass the railroad if you give me personally a bunch of money. And so north and south, we've already talked about this in Reconstruction governments that's going on at this time, but in the north too, we're going to see lots of corruption between railroad companies and governments as railroad companies try to bribe state or federal officials into choosing their railroad or giving them these low interest loans. All right, the last thing on this slide, if we look in the bottom left-hand corner, we see how the railroad companies actually got the land. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you see this kind of yellowish color with the railroad track going across it. And so that land would be given by the government, but so would land on both sides of the track in alternating squares. And so all the pink squares are going to be given by the United States government to the railroad company. Now, obviously, they're not using all of those pink squares to build the railroad, and so what the railroad company will then be able to do is sell that land to make a profit. So not only are the railroads getting to be able to build these railroads cheaply because the government's just giving them land and cheap loans, but they're also letting the railroad companies sell their excess land to farmers and to make a buck, and so that helps defray the cost of the railroad. So this is a sweet deal for railroad companies. And why this land is so important is because it's right next to the railroad. So just by having the railroad there, the value of the land goes up, which means the railroad can charge farmers who are going to settle out west as much as they possibly can. So they're going to make quite a bit of money off of these railroads. The squares, the alternating squares that are not pink, that they're a blue color, those are going to be what the United States government keeps to give out as part of the Homestead Act. But what we notice here is part of the Homestead Act, which we talked about before, that gives away free land out west. It does, of course, it's a good thing for farmers, but a lot of the land, the really good land, the land next to the railroads, is already going to be given away to the railroad companies. So the Homestead Act does help farmers get cheap land, but not as much as we would think, because a lot of the good land has already gone to the railroad companies, either to build their track on or for them to sell to help defray some of the cost. And so we do see settlement of the West at this time, but it's not just because of private business, but it's also because the federal government and state governments and local governments get involved to try to promote railroad growth. So let's talk about the most important one, the Transcontinental Railroad. If you remember, before the Civil War, as part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, Stephen Douglas wanted a northern route. And so we're going to see that the railroad was put on delay because the North and the South eventually still couldn't agree, even after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, to start the railroad. But during the Civil War in 1862, the Republican-controlled Congress, because remember the Democrats, a lot of them are Southerners and they're out of the country, they go ahead and without much opposition, because Republicans are in charge in the Civil War, they pass the Railway Act of 1862, which says that the government is going to build a transcontinental railroad. Well, private companies are, but the government is going to give them land grants and low-interest loans. And so we see the first transcontinental railroad start in 1862-63, and it's going to go from Omaha to San Francisco, across the Great Plains, over the Rocky Mountains, across deserts in Utah, over the Sierra Nevadas, and then eventually get to the West Coast through San Francisco and Sacramento. In 1869, we see this railroad completed. Its construction is completed. We have two railroads. We have the Union Pacific Railroad Company that is building from Omaha west, and then we see the Central Pacific, which is building from Sacramento east. And the two railroads, construction companies, they meet together in Utah, just north of Salt Lake, in a place called Promontory Point. We see the two railroad companies coming together, and they're toasting in the picture because they're happy. Now we finally have a transcontinental railroad, which will greatly reduce the amount of time it takes to get west. The Transcontinental Railroad continued. So who built the railroad? We know that the United States government played a part. We know that, of course, these railroad companies played a part. But who actually did the building? And this is primarily, if we're going to talk about the Central Pacific, the railroad that is starting in Sacramento and going east, it's primarily going to be built by a new immigrant group that has been coming in greater and greater numbers, Chinese immigrants. The economy with China was not doing well in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, and so the Chinese they're pushed out of China because of not very many economic opportunities. But as America is going through this Gilded Age, this time of industrial revolution, they're going to be attracted to the United States to come here for the jobs. And as we talked about Chinese filling worker roles in San Francisco during the gold rush, but now we're going to see them building the railroad. And so we see a whole bunch of Chinese here, and they are helping to build the railroad across the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's very dangerous work. The railroad companies saw lots of fatalities of the railroad workers. They weren't that concerned if they lost railroad workers because they're immigrants and we can pay them a small amount of money. They're desperate. We can always replace them. So it was a very dangerous job working on the railroad. The Union Pacific, which is the railroad building from Omaha west, they're primarily going to use, and also another immigrant group, but this one from Europe, Irish workers. Irish are still continuing to come into America because of, one, the potato famine, but also the economy of Ireland is not very good, and we have all of these jobs. And so we see Irishmen, most of them settle in the Northeast, but some of them do come out west to work on the railroads. And again, it's very dangerous work. They don't get very much pay, but it certainly is better than starving to death in Ireland. Okay, and so next we have this concept of hell on wheels. These railroad companies, what they would do, they'd be out in the middle of nowhere, and they would have the construction materials on the train, and the workers would go out in front of the train. They would spend all day laying another mile or two of track. Once they got that done, then the railroad would chug forward a couple of miles to the just completed track, and then the workers would actually stay on dormitories that were train cars. And so every time the workers got paid, not only would there be a dormitory on the train, but there would also be saloons and brothels. And so we see this as kind of the part of the Wild West. We see these Chinese or Irish immigrants living out in the middle of nowhere, working for the railroad company, and almost for free, because they would get very low pay on payday, and then the railroad company would make most of that money back because the workers would spend their money in the company saloon or in the company brothel, and so the railroad company would tend to recoup most of its losses in pay back from these workers. And so we see these kind of all-male rolling company towns where we see railroad workers putting the tracks together that will connect America. Impact of the railroads on the economy. So this is a point I made earlier. What we're going to see is that the railroads, represented here by these black lines, they're going to connect America. All of the new resources of the West, whether it be cattle ranches in Texas, cotton production in the South, because we're going to be building railroads. Of course, you remember during Reconstruction, there's lots of corruption in the South as we try to build railroads as well. Gold and silver out West, wheat and corn on the Great Plains, all of those raw materials are going to be connected to the factories in the Northeast. And so now our factories can get bigger, they have more resources. And then, of course, as we see by the line here, we're going to see factories be able to sell their products, their finished goods, out to greater and greater numbers of people, to bigger markets, whether they're back out west or in the South or in the cities of the East. And so the U.S. economy is really getting tied together, north, south, east, west, because of these railroads. And so the result of that, and a big trend we need to pay attention to in this lecture, is that businesses are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. In part because they have more resources that they can draw on, and they have just unlimited number of markets. It's not just the town that you can sell to, but now it's all of America or all of the world. And so we're going to see that the trend is businesses get bigger and bigger and bigger through competition, and eventually, by the end of this lecture, we're going to see that some industries are completely dominated by one or two businesses. So the age of super large corporations is about to occur. So who is going to work in these factories? Who is going to build these railroads? And so we talked about the Chinese and the Irish, but we're going to see immigration in America dramatically increase during the Gilded Age. Simply because we're going through our second industrial revolution, we have millions of jobs available. So that is going to attract immigrants to come to the United States. We have two kinds of immigrants, though. We have immigrants coming from other countries, like I said, the Irish or the Chinese, but we also have immigration happening within America. As farm technology increases, we don't need as many farmers on the farm, and so we're going to see this internal migration as excess children on farms are going to go to the city and look for jobs in the city. So America is certainly on the move. All of these people moving to factories, wanting to get jobs in factories, of course, leads to urbanization. Cities get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so we see factories connected to railways, and then around those factories we see workers who are living in the factories. They set up home, they set up house. And so cities like New York, and especially Chicago at this time, or Cleveland, or Cincinnati, we see their size just explode. So here's a picture of New York City at the end of this time period, and it's massive overcrowding, immigrants coming from all over the world. This is Little Italy, I believe, on the Lower East Side. Also, lots of Jewish immigrants coming on the Lower East Side of New York. And so we're going to see that cities are going to be growing not just out, but also up as all of these people cram into these cities looking for jobs. The more food part of that is that since we are able to have better farm technology, now it takes fewer and fewer farmers to feed all of these people. And so now cities can also get bigger just because we have more food. Food is in abundance because of new technology. All right. Number 7, railroad barons rise to control the industry. So a baron, if we're in Europe, a baron is a lord, a noble, somebody like a duke. And so we see this concept that America is getting a new aristocracy. They're not nobles because of birth, but they have just as much power as nobles in Europe because they are going to dominate industry. So a couple of slides ago, I said that businesses are going to get so big that a few businesses will dominate an entire industry. That's true for railroads. And so we're going to see a few railroad men who rise up and they will control all the railroads in a given area. So let me give you 2 examples. One is William H. Vanderbilt. His nickname was the Commodore, and he is going to control a lot of railroads on the East Coast. And then on the West Coast, we're going to have another railroad magnate, another railroad capitalist who controls all of the roads on the West Coast, or a lot of them, and his name is Leland Stanford. Famous because later on he will give a huge endowment to create a university, Stanford University. Same with Vanderbilt on the East Coast. And so we see these railroad men who have lots of power, and they control all the railroad industry, and so we're going to call them railroad barons, or sometimes called robber barons. These are the people who are going to control all of these railroads. Now, the reason we drop sometimes railroad and replace it with robber baron, as you can see in the picture, these men who control the railroads, they have a monopoly in their area of who gets to travel on the railroad. If you're Leland Stanford and you control most of the railroads on the West Coast, if you are a farmer or a manufacturer and you want to get your crops or your goods to market, and there's only one man who controls the railroads, well, you have to use him. And so he can charge just about whatever price he can or he wants to, and people have to give up that price. And so here we see in the picture the robber baron, the guy who owns the railroads, and he is able to hold up farmers. You can see farmers are dying on the front of the train. Small businessmen in the white hat, miners, is another small businessman on the right. He is saying, stick him up. You have to pay me what I demand if you want to get your crops to market, if you want to get your goods to market. And so we see a very negative view of some of these really wealthy railroad men come up in America from the people who don't have a lot of money. They resent these railroad barons or robber barons from having so much power. And so how did these men gain in power? How were they able to drive their competitors out of business and establish a monopoly of all the railroads in a certain area? And so we see one technique they do is they cut prices. So these are business techniques that these guys use, these robber barons, that we still see businesses use today. And it's a way, again, to get rid of your competition. And the goal of any business is to drive your competition out of business. And so then you have monopoly. Just like in the game Monopoly, the goal is to drive everybody out of business so you control the board. That's the goal of capitalism, is to be able to compete with your rivals and eventually drive them out of business. And one way to do that is to cut prices. And so we will see that in the short run, your profits go down. But if you're able to cut prices and keep operating, then you can drive your competitors out of business because maybe they can't cut the prices as much as you. So you attract more customers. And eventually, as your competitors go out of business because they can't cut prices like you can, you will take more and more and more of the market share, and you will eventually be the only business in town. And then if you want to, just like in the picture, you could raise prices to whatever you want and force your customers to pay it because you have a monopoly. They can't go anyplace else. So as a modern day example of this, we could certainly look to Walmart. Walmart is a retail giant because they use this practice. They give low prices, and it's very hard for Target or Kmart or some mom and pop store on the corner to cut their prices as much. And so they go out of business, and eventually Walmart takes more and more and more of the market, and then maybe someday they'll have all the market. That's the only place you can go for clothes or tires or whatever, and then they could raise their prices because they're the only game in town. Next way to drive your competitors out of business that we see at this time is this thing called secret rebates. A secret rebate, of course, it's done in secret. You can't know about it. And so what happens is, if I'm a railroad company and I want Joe's Fish Market, let's say, to use my railroad company instead of my competitor. So I publish my rates. I say, well, I'm going to charge you $1,000 per ton to ship your fish to market. And so, my competitor says, well, I'm going to use cutting prices. And so my competitor says, I will charge you $800 a ton. So, of course, Joe's Fish Market should use my competitor. It's cheaper. It's $800 a ton. But surprise, surprise, he still uses my company at $1,000 a ton. And my competitor can't figure that out. Why is Joe's Fish Market using my company at $1,000 a ton and not his company at $800 a ton? And the reason is secret rebates. What I'm doing is to get Joe's business, I am posting the price of $1,000 a ton, but then I'm going to Joe and I say, look, Joe, pay me the $1,000 a ton and I will give you $300 back. You can put in your pocket. And I don't tell anybody I'm doing this because I don't want my competition to figure out how I'm beating him. And so I give him a secret rebate of $300. Eventually, since nobody is using my competitor's railroad, he goes out of business. And so that's the whole goal. That's a way to drive your people out of business by sending back just a little bit money under the table so nobody knows to your customers, so they choose you, and your competitors don't understand what's going on, why they're not choosing them. Next, you form a pool. A pool is when a bunch of businesses come together to drive other businesses out of business. So let's go back to my example of Joe's Fish Market. Let's say, again, I want his business, and there are 3 railroads in the region that could help Joe get his fish. It's my railroad. It's company B, so I'm company A. Then we have company B, and then we have company C. So we're all competing. All 3 companies are competing for Joe's fish market business. We want him to ship his fish on our railroads. And so I hate company C. They're my main competitor. And so I go to company B and I say, hey, look, you and me, company B and me, company A, let's form together, let's form a pool. We'll share our resources. We'll pool our resources, our railroads, our money, our capital, and we will be able to then, since we have more money together, and more customers together, we will be able to then cut our prices since we're sharing the cost between companies A and B, and we can drive company C out of business. Right? And once that happens, then maybe A and B will go back to being competitors, but let's join together now to force the other company out of business. And so we see that this is yet another tool these robber barons use to become the only guy in charge of an area. Now, all of these things, of course, lead for you to drive your competitors out of business, and once you're in control, you can charge as much as you want. There is nobody else that Joe's Fish Market could use. I have driven company C out of business, and maybe when they're out of business, then I go against company B, even though they were former partner, and I cut prices, or I do secret rebates, and I drive them out of business. And now Joe's Fish Market, they can only use me to get their fish. And so, like in the cartoon, I hold a gun to their head, metaphorically, and I say, look, if you want fish and continue to do your business, you have to pay me $2,000 a ton. And they can't do anything about it but pay the price because I have a monopoly. I am the only railroad company in the region. So this is exactly how Vanderbilt and Stanford were able to build up their fortunes and build up control of railroads in their region. Next, corruption and the railroads. Anytime we see large businesses that are making a ton of money, we're going to see, it's just human nature, we're going to see corruption in businesses and in the government. So let's talk about watering stock. So let me use another metaphor or an example. Let's say that I am a cowboy and I'm driving my longhorn cattle to market. So I've raised these cattle and I'm driving them to market to sell. Now, right before I get to market, I know that my cattle get paid by the ton. They weigh my cows, and for that, they tell me, well, we're going to pay you 10 cents a pound. So I want the heaviest cows I can, because when they weigh them, if they weigh more than less, then I'm able to get more money. And so what I do, it's an old cowboy trick, is right before my cattle get to market, I give them a whole bunch of salt licks, which means they lick that salt, and they lick that salt, and then they're really thirsty. And so my cattle start drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking to quench their thirst. And that is called watering stock. Now my cows are bloated with water, not so much meat but water. They get on the scale, and lo and behold, my cattle weigh more. And so I'm able to get maximum prices for my cattle, even though they actually don't weigh what the scale says, because it's all water weight. Well, that's a technique that I said cowboys use, but railroad companies are going to do the same thing. They're going to water their stock. And so what they do is these railroad companies, right, they sell stock to raise capital. So if I'm railroad company A again, and I want to build a new railroad, or I want to bribe a politician or whatever, I need money. And so I go to the American public and I say, my company is doing amazing. My company has record profits, and if you want to buy part of my company, here you go. Buy some of my stock. So my investor gives me, let's say, $1,000, or in this case, as you can see on the picture, $50. And so they give me $50, so they are a part sharer of my company. Sorry about the bell. And so they own part of my company, but I now have $50 more that I can use to build up my company, build railroads, whatever. So watering stock means that what I do is I lie to my investors, just like the cowboy did. I tell them that my company is doing amazing business, even though maybe it isn't in reality. So I just bold-faced lie to them. And so they think my company really is worth $50 a share instead of $2 a share. And so I'm able to cheat my investors and make them give me more money. So that's called watering stock. Of course, today you can't do this. The federal government regulates this. They say you can't lie to your investors. But one thing we're going to find out in the Gilded Age is that the government did not see that as their function. They're certainly going to help business grow, but otherwise, they're going to take a hands-off approach to business. They're not going to say, we're not going to force you to do anything that you don't want to do. That's called laissez-faire. It means in French, hands-off or hands-free. And so this certainly is an age of laissez-faire, where the federal government is going to let businesses do whatever they want, even if it's illegal or not really ethical, and we're just going to leave them alone. The only thing that we are going to do is we certainly are going to help businesses grow. We're going to give them land grants or cheap loans. So we see businesses and the government have this kind of weird relationship where the government helps businesses grow, but don't do anything to control or regulate their bad behavior. If all else fails and you still can't, let's say you want to really drive your competitors out of business, and you have tried cutting prices, you've tried forming pools, whatever, and you just can't get that other company out of business, you sue them. And sue them for some kind of bad business practice, or you say they did something illegal or whatever. So you sue them, and so what you do is that you can ensure that you can win and drive your competitor out of business by you just bribe a judge. You have the court case, it's you versus them, and you bribe the judge, you give them $10,000 and say, look, rule for me. And that will happen. Or you bribe a politician. Let's say you and another railroad company are trying to build a railroad in the state of California. You bribe all the politicians in California to choose your railroad company over the other person's railroad company, and so you get the business and they don't. You win. And so we see certainly this is a time of corruption in government. So that will end our first part of the Gilded Age lecture. When we come back in part 2, we'll talk about industrialization and invention.